Hi, this is Brian Orender, President of Charitable Advisors. We get frequent requests and have frequent conversations with nonprofit board members, board leaders, executive directors, CEOs about the executive search process and retirements, sometimes dismissals, those kinds of things. So I wanted to take just a couple minutes and provide an introduction kind of overview of what that process looks like, and be able to give you some hints and some thoughts to look at over a course of, we'll see how long this takes, 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to try to move through pretty quickly. We've got a number of slides here. I won't read them all to you, but they might be of interest as we move along. So get the pages turning here. So I'm Brian Orender, like I said. We've been around almost 20 years. We do the nonprofit salary survey. We were co-founders of the Get On Board event that now is hosted by Leadership Indianapolis. I'm also a board source certified governance trainer. Some of our recent searches, you recognize some of those names. I think we've done all those. I think all those were 2020 and 2021. So we're doing about 15 local nonprofit executive director and CEO searches every year, by far more than anybody else. Probably in the state, even in terms of specifically nonprofit leader searches. I'm going to talk about three time frames that you might be coming into. The first is 2 to 3 years before retirement or a defined departure, and that could be somebody relocating, but it's almost always a retirement. And when that conversation starts. The next is, again, when you have a little bit of notice for a defined departure retirement, 8 or 9 months when things start, and then that kind of oh, we didn't know this was coming. Letter of resignation or notice that your leader's moving on and you need to move on, or maybe the board's made the decision. So one important component here is recognizing kind of what's the relationship dynamic you've had with your executive director, CEO. On the left there, board is very directive to the executive director. That can be, maybe you've got a founder on the board, maybe the executive director has been very new, but the board's accustomed to providing a lot of specific direction. That's not ideal in the long term, but that could be a short-term situation. The other C there, bottom right, is where the executive director is pretty much guiding the board. And the board is kind of, hey, let me know what you need. Hey, we're happy to help, let us know. But they really are very dependent on the executive director. That often happens when an executive director has been doing a pretty good job and has been in position for a long time, that the board becomes very dependent on that executive director or CEO to keep things moving along. So what we see sometimes in a leadership transition is that this executive director that the board is very dependent on is moving on. So the board has to recognize that their role is going to evolve a little bit, and they're going to need to step up a little bit and sharing that leadership role. So you see B there at the top right is really where the board and executive director or CEO are working as partners. So that's ultimately where you want to end up. So being very conscious and recognizing that a leadership transition is the time where the board is stepping up, taking the lead, taking responsibility for the organization that they've had all along, but often haven't recognized. And so they're stepping in, and that's also a good time to kind of reset the working relationship with a new leader who's coming in. So we're looking at the 2 to 3 years out. This is kind of, and I don't suggest that a leader who's looking at retirement give a specific date, because there are other extenuating circumstances there, but it's really helpful to be able to kind of say, okay, I'm getting within 2 or 3 years, let's make sure that we have things ready, kind of in place. Okay, so that doesn't mean telling all the staff, it doesn't mean telling everybody, but starting to think about, do we have internal successors that we should be thinking about or building into potentially? Are we going to have a strong board in place? Do we need to be recruiting a few more board members? Do we need to make sure we've got, a really strong candidate to be the board chair during the next transition to help bridge that? Who might we want to have involved in the search process? And are we going to do it ourselves, or are we going to look for outside, search support? So again, you're not making the announcement here. You're kind of starting to look ahead, and we've got this kind of quick readiness checklist. Do you have your strategic plan in place? Are you doing regular evaluations with the board and the executive director? Is the board evaluating itself? Do you have strong leaders in other roles besides the executive director, CEO role? Are you making sure that there aren't any exclusive relationships, especially with funders and big donors, that if the executive director, CEO is the only person they know, you need to be strengthening those relationships. And then you want to make sure your financial systems are in place, and you've built an operating reserve, and you've got processes, documented, and those kinds of things. Just getting ready for the handoff to the next leader. Okay, so again, in that situation, then we come down to 8 or 9 months out. That's the time frame where I suggest that the executive director, CEO, go to the board chair and say, "Okay, I'm ready now to talk about this. Let's kind of set up our timeline and the target transition time." And at that point, I think it is helpful for the CEO to give a specific date. It makes it real. It'll take the board maybe a month or two to kind of, get their feet under them, step in, get a search committee together, put a communication plan together, and start then moving through the process. So the other situation you can have, or I guess we have a couple more here, but another one is that your executive director could be giving notice, and moving on to something else. So this is where having an emergency succession plan in place helps a little bit. But at the very least, the executive committee has to be prepared to step in quickly and pull a few people together and say, okay, let's put our heads together. Let's figure out how we're going to communicate around this. Let's figure out whether we need an interim and how we would do that. Don't automatically elevate one of your staff members or throw a board member in to be the interim without thinking about it. There are ramifications to some of that, and sometimes the most convenient thing won't be the best thing. So take a little time to think about that and what that looks like. There are a number of consultants and retired executive directors that do interim work, and that can be very helpful to have somebody come in and usually it's on a part-time basis as kind of a placeholder to let all your staff continue to work in their sweet spots. To be able to serve as a liaison to the board and kind of a coach and kind of keep things moving along through the process. We don't do that, but we can help you find an interim if that would be helpful. So as you go through, then you're launching the search, you're reviewing candidates, interviews, offers, those kinds of things again over that usually 3 to 4 month period. So an interim can be really helpful in helping the board have the space to do that. So the other opportunity could be that the board has made the tough decision that this executive director is not the right person for the organization, right now. So there's a lot to happen there. You want to make sure you're communicating. We're always advising, make sure you've given that executive director opportunity to improve. That sometimes lack of communication, clear expectations, things can get out of alignment, personalities. So, make sure that you've got some communication around there that an employee should never be surprised that the board doesn't think they're performing, right? So also bring in your attorney or HR advisor, before you fire somebody, because there's, the realm of other legal issues that you want to make sure you have figured out, and they can kind of coach you through, here's the way to do this. And, are you going to have some kind of a severance agreement in exchange for, wrapping up the agreement. And then you talk about interim strategies. Again, make sure you get passwords and keys and, all of those kinds of things, and prepare for the search. So a few notes about interims. Usually think about interims if there's short notice. So like either you've dismissed the exec, or you're getting ready to, or an individual has given fairly short notice. So it fits in there. If the organization's in crisis, right? If it's a financial crisis, if you've just been in the news for a bad reason, because unfortunately nonprofits hardly ever get in the news for good reasons. It could be that nobody would want to come work for you, or at least the candidate of caliber, the caliber of candidate you would want right now wouldn't want to work for you. So being able to kind of take a breather, have somebody come in, maybe even somebody that brings a different level of expertise. Maybe you've got some financial issues, or you got some facility issues or something where you could bring somebody in, and while they're the interim, they could help you figure something out, and then hand off to your next long-term leader. I mentioned a couple of the benefits of using an interim before. A really big one is it keeps the board from having to step into the day-to-day and lets the staff continue to do what they do well. It also lets that interim give the board some objective feedback, to say, hey, here's where your organization really is. Here's some things that are going well. Here's some things that aren't going well. Our recommendation would always be that the interim is not a candidate for the position, because if they are, they can jockey for position. They can put themselves in a favor and show themselves in a favorable light. So the dynamics of the organization work much better if you bring an interim in who's not a candidate for the position. A couple, it's kind of natural to think about internal interims to say, well, let's just have this person just kind of take on that additional role, for a while. They know the organization, at least near term, there's, it's less money out. The downside is that once somebody has moved into that role, it's really hard to move them back to their old role. You have a much higher likelihood that you could end up losing another person, in the mix. And board members can be interims, but again, look at who that board member is, right? And are they somebody that you would want to reach out to and bring into the role if they weren't already associated? But too often, again, it's the convenience thing. Well, we have, Brian is retired, or Brian was just laid off, or Brian was, so the convenience hire is not usually the best hire. So make sure you're bringing in, kind of the best person in the circumstance, that you reasonably can. So kind of budgeting questions, around the search. There are different types of search firms, right? So that you've got the traditional executive search firm. They charge about 30% of the compensation package. Some will base it on salary, some will be salary plus benefits. Minimums are often in the $30,000 to $50,000, kind of range. So it's an investment, but they will go out and they will find the candidates, right? And they will bring those candidates in, vetted for you to review. In our circumstance, we are affordable and local. So we are trying to be experts on central Indiana. We do a few searches out in other spots around Indiana, but we don't go outside Indiana. And so our pricing structure is generally about a third of a traditional executive search firm, but we do not do national searches. So if somebody is looking for a national search, then a traditional search firm is probably the best way to go there. Other expenses you'll have there, just one other, relocation. In general, most nonprofits, especially small to mid-sized nonprofits, kind of where we work, they're not giving big lavish relocation packages. There's usually, a fixed amount of money, $10,000, $20,000, whatever, to contribute toward relocation. So that's a piece of the puzzle when a candidate's considering a move. But what we find, well over 90% of the leaders of small to mid-sized nonprofits are coming from the local or the regional area. They're not very often moving here specifically for the job. They might be planning to come back and looking for a job, so they're moving here. But they're not very often relocating specifically, for the job from, some other part of the country. So that covers a lot of the pieces of the puzzle. Tried to move through quickly and not, get down into too much detail. Kathleen Poland is our nonprofit recruiter. She's awesome. You can reach out to either one of us. It's Brian with a Y at Charitable Advisors or Kathleen at Charitable Advisors. Love to have a short conversation with you, whether you're the board member or the CEO, and just talk about how you kind of get things in order. Again, those first couple conversations are usually around communications and timeline. The communications go a lot easier if you have a timeline kind of figured out. And if you have, if you decided, often we find that our clients, they bring us in first, we get to help them kind of put some of the communication plans together and things like that. And when they're able then to say, here's our plan and we're working with this firm, it just helps people relax, to know that, that things are under control. So thank you for your time.